Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us for the inaugural symposium for the Institute of Advertising Ethics and the AAF. My name is Joe Mandese. I'm editor-in-chief of Media Post, and I was invited to more or less moderate or keep a conversation going among two of the industry's thought leaders. So after this intro, I'll bring on screen Bob Perkins, who is currently the Chief Operating Officer of Brightpool, the leading cookieless identity solution resolution company. Bob is uniquely qualified to discuss ethical issues in advertising. He has 30 plus years of career experience as an executive in roles on the agency, client, and ad tech side. He brings this broad perspective to the discussion. Today, Brightpool is at the forefront of aligning the advertiser identity, targeting, and consumer privacy concerns. And then we also have Shane Ankeney, who is the president of Havas Media Group North America, an award-winning media services division of the global agency holding company, Havas. He is a marketing pioneer of holistic marketing communications planning, focused on defining a vision of what's coming in and grounded enough to craft an actionable plan to get there and build one of the most elite teams of strategists and connections planners in the world. Media Post inducted him as an industry all-star last year, and a year before that, he and his agency were named our Agency of the Year, largely for some of the things we're going to get into in this conversation today. So just let me explain that this symposium will resume later today at 2 o'clock with some other thought leadership discussions. The idea here was to really focus on the concept of consumer self-sovereignty, or as it's popularly known in the industry, consumer identity self-sovereignty. Just a little quick recap, if you're not around for later today. The Institute of Advertising Ethics was incubated under the AAF and is kind of spinning off with this symposium today. These sessions will be recorded and will be used as part of the groundwork for creating industry standards and ideally an accreditation system later on, so that people in the ad industry could be accredited for ethics much the way doctors, lawyers, or people in other industries could. So again, I'm the editor-in-chief of Media Post. We're a trade publication that covers advertising, media, and marketing, heavily into ad tech and issues like data and how people make money with it. And so we've been introduced to Brightpool and Bob Perkins, and to Shane and Havas. And I just want to lead off with a quote from Bob's partner, Dave Moore, when they launched Brightpool a year ago. I thought this really kind of summed up what their mission statement is pretty well. You know, the industry is at a critical inflection point. You can read the description here. Let me just take this off. At a critical inflection point, motivated by rising consumer confusion and distrust of the ecosystem, government regulation ranging from GDPR in Europe and CCPA in California, which will require new and innovative approaches to incent and encourage consumers to voluntarily share their identity information in a safe and secure environment. They will only do so if they find the value exchange fair and transparent. At the same time, publishers and brands alike, under tremendous pressure today, need stronger identity management tools to ensure more effective and robust advertising. And I should say, normally when we do panels like this or discussions like this, we like people on the supply and demand side. And yes, we could have had a publisher on the other demand side, but I think having an ad tech company like Brightpool was a good way to frame the issue, because they're trying to solve the problem. They're an upstart startup, but I think you'll see some interesting conversations from Bob going forward. The reason we picked Shane is I've known him well for about 10 years now, and he's really been a thought leader on this issue. It's part of the reason we picked him as an all-star last year. And it's the reason we picked him as their agency, as the Agency of the Year, the preceding year. We're really pro-transparency at Media Post, and we recognize industry leaders who promote it. Normally we talk about transparency within the industry between the suppliers, publishers, and ad tech firms, and the demand side, advertisers and agencies. But what Havas did is they took an early leadership position in consumer transparency. And, it's part and parcel with the kind of manifesto that Havas has around what does it mean to be a meaningful brand, and having your consumers trust you. I just want to say a little bit of history here. I started covering this whole issue back when Havas was really the first of the major agency holding companies to lean into the concept of trading consumer data. And they acquired a digital agency that had a database platform called Artemis. And it was really the first of the data management platforms that had assembled consumer cookies worldwide. I think at the height, they had about 50% of all consumer cookies worldwide. And they started trading on it. And they created what was the first agency trading desk. It was then called Adnetic. It was eventually called Vigilant and spun off from Havas. And that's important because at this time, a lot of agencies started assembling and acquiring consumer data to build their own data management platforms to target consumers. And most of them did it so that they could acquire it. And they built these agency trading desks to work with the ad tech partners to leverage it. At some point, Havas kind of backed away from that. They spun off Vigilant and Adnetic. They still have a lot of data about consumers, but they started moving more towards a permission-based concept. And I think you'll see right now, and then I'll kind of shut up on the intro, there's kind of a rift within Madison Avenue right now where you see some big agency holding companies like Havas. I would also put a couple of others in that bucket, Omnicom, and ironically WPP, which have been heavily pushing for control of consumer data, has backed off it with their Group M platform and is leaning more towards conventional media buying attributes. At the same time, you've seen giant agency holding companies like Publicis and Interpublic literally acquire the biggest consumer data companies in the world, Epsilon and Axiom, to create proprietary ways of doing this. And my last anecdote, and we could get into the conversation, was what really struck me was when I started covering the development of this after Adnetic and Havas, and a company, Interpublic's Media Brands, was developing these kinds of platforms. And they told me something that is something they're really leaning in today. They said, Joe, we no longer buy media, we buy audiences. And it was at that point I realized something was going on here, and we're now starting to trade human beings as derivatives in an open exchange marketplace. So with that, I'll take off the screen share and we'll get into the conversation. Second. Okay, so now we have some talking heads. I'm just gonna give I'll give a couple of definitions here and then we'll go into an opening question, which is, the word sovereignty is a powerful word. I mean, it literally means complete authority or control over something. The concept of self-sovereignty or self-ownership really emerged around the feudal era, when literally people were owned by feudal lords. And it's progressed ever since, all the way through modern day democracy. But the concept of self-sovereign identity is a newer term. It's kind of an ad tech term. And what it means is that basically it recognizes that individuals should own and control their own identity, their own data associated with themselves. And the reason for that is multifold, ethical, but also because it has market value and market power to it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bob and Shane and ask you if you could each define, how do you define the term of self-sovereignty as it relates to consumers, and what are you doing to enable it?
Well, thanks, Joe, for the kind introduction and a complicated and interesting topic. By education, I studied economics, and of course, in economics, self-sovereignty really talks about the ability of consumers to influence the products, the goods and services that society manufactures. And what we're seeing is essentially self-sovereignty exhibiting itself as consumers awaken to a whole new world. In a previous century, I did a lot of direct marketing, and we appended data to the customer list all the time. But Shane bought a new car on January 1st, and on February 1st, he got a license, and on March 1st, the government turned it into a database, and on April 1st, Polk finally got a hold of it, and on May 1st, they finally rented the list, and on June 1st, I could send out a piece of direct mail. Shane, congratulations on the new car. Shane wasn't very nervous about that because the car was 6 months old. To him, gee, it gets the words out. Whereas today, you bring your new car home at 10 o'clock in the morning, you post it to Facebook at 10:15, and at 10:30, you're getting an email or a online ad saying, Shane, welcome, congrats on the new car. And it's a lot more frightening. So I think what's really going on is not so much an issue of, it's an issue of timeliness, but it's an issue of consumer awareness, gradually educating to them as to what their options are, and trying to find a balance between no one wants to spend 20 minutes a day trying to figure out whether they're going to let this site use that piece of data and that site use that piece of data. So to go back to the beginning, I think what's encouraging to me is we are seeing consumers slowly express their self-sovereignty, and we're seeing the marketplace react to it.
That's
but
great.
It's not going to be over. It's not going to be it's not a black and white deal.
Well, Shane, you deal with some of the most sensitive consumer marketing categories in the world: health, finance, really high ticket items. How do you define this concept of self-sovereignty, and what is Havas Media doing about it?
Yeah, no, first of all, let me echo Bob's sentiments. Thank you very much for including me and us in this panel, and this discussion. Is obviously a area that we feel passionate about and have for quite a while. To your great intro, I mean, I define it similarly. And rather simply, it's consumers in control. Consumers in control of their data, their profile, their information, et cetera. I think just to echo or build on what Bob said, I think what's holding it back is consumers, mass consumers, lots of consumers, not fully grasping and not fully understanding and not fully being able to realize exactly what's happening, what's going on, et cetera. I think it's getting more. I think it's growing. I think some of the practices that Bob so nicely illustrated, I think, are probably leading to a ramping up of that knowledge base, but it's still something that we are in the kind of quote unquote infancy. I think to your point, Joe, I mean, you know, you and I have had some passionate discussions about this topic. I think in all categories, there should be some level of empowerment of the consumer. There should be complete transparency to the consumer. I think, to your point, pharmaceutical, financial, there are categories that amp it up even more and need it even more. Pharmaceutical is probably the most noteworthy, because if you're talking about someone's health, if you're talking about someone's well-being, if you're talking about something that someone is, you know, heaven forbid, dare I say, suffering from, that's their business and their doctor's business only. So that's something that we take very, very seriously. But financial, you could argue, is similar. You know, someone's financial information, financial well-being, et cetera, is at least similar. But quite honestly, it's something that, you know, we believe, as you said in the intro, we believe that this is something that we should be moving toward across the board. To Bob's example of a car, to a package of cheese, to a pharmaceutical brand, it's something that we should be trying to move toward and aspire to across the board.
Well, thank you both for that opening. When I listened to Bob's description of that daisy chain of data passed along, you know, this discussion is really about ethics, but I think about how inefficient the process really is, and maybe ineffective, that by the time you get access to that data, it's latent, old, and stale. And but there was a subtext in there that I want to get from both of you, which is who actually owns the data. So with some of the examples we just cited with finance and with health, the government actually regulated in the United States. We have something called the FICO laws and something called the HIPAA laws. In both those cases, they were intended to create laws that gave the consumer control over their own data. The irony is that in both those cases, the consumers actually lost control of their data. I mean, this is an argument, but we could spend a whole nother panel discussion going about that. But the reality is, that data is used in your FICO score to pigeonhole you as a value. Same thing with the HIPAA laws. The data goes to providers and pharmacies and healthcare providers, not to the consumer. So I just want to ask you more broadly, who actually owns the data, and should the consumer own and control all their data? Or when a brand has their first party data, quote unquote, their CRM data, because a consumer opted into it, is that the brand's data?
Well, I think, not to go wonky on the economic side, a guy named Kors won a Nobel Prize for transaction costs. And the real issue here is transaction costs, because consumers could opt out of anything. No consumer has to do anything. Now, my car example is an interesting example because the government makes the consumer register the car by law. The consumer has no choice, and therefore the government decides to sell it. So that's the government that you just referred to, Joe, behaving paradoxically, if I can use that word. But the big problem is that most people aren't willing to go through the challenge or the difficulty of asking, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to give my data up? And the example you use is the perfect one. When you opt into Google or Facebook or lots of other sites, Amazon, you give up a lot of rights. And of course, you have the right not to opt in. No one's making you use Google. No one's making you use Facebook, although they are pseudo monopolies, in my opinion. No one's making you use Amazon. And you give up, you make an exchange with your data. So I think the real problem is not who owns it. I think the real problem is, how do you talk to consumers in a way that this all makes sense to them? And by and large, governments have vastly outstripped consumers. If you look at any consumer research, everybody says this is a problem, but you look at the alternative browsers, very few people have done it. Apple did it on behalf of consumers. I've yet to see the study that said, hey, 80% of our people wanted this. So it's really a matter of, it's like seatbelts. They were around for a long time before people used them. It took a pretty big education campaign. And one of the things we realized at Brightpool is that's part of our responsibility. We're going to have to help educate consumers as their choices and do it in an interesting and fun way. It's why our logo, which is behind me, is whimsical, because if consumers aren't going to buy into this if it's too serious.
Well, those are great points. Shane, who owns the data and why?
Yeah, that's a a multi-billion dollar question, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, I think, to kind of add to what Bob said, it's, in my mind, it's less about ownership and it's more about the value exchange. And I think consumers are growingly aware, growingly educated and knowledgeable of the value exchange in a lot of different areas. Commercially supported TV and video, they understand that they would have to pay for those things if it wasn't commercially supported. I think that ultimately there is a value exchange that some consumers like what they get from a Google or a Facebook or from ad targeting to their preferences, because so they see enough value there that they're okay doing it. I still think, and Bob alluded to this as well, I still think we're in the infancy of consumer knowledge. I don't believe, and we are at the early stages of consumers truly understanding all the data that they put out, all the information that is out there that they generate, to Bob's example, by typing something into a Google search box, like by going on to Facebook and behaving and doing certain behaviors. They only now are starting to understand the immense amount of data that they are populating the world with. And I think, again, we should educate consumers. We should educate and have an education campaign that people understand more. And then I think you would start to see more and more action. But, right now we're not we're not seeing a ton of that. There are ad blockers. Everyone quotes certain percentages of people that use ad blockers. I personally think that's just avoiding the annoyance avoidance, as I say. It isn't truly what we're talking about here. I think a tremendous amount of education still needs to happen in order for consumers to understand the value of their data and how truly valuable it is in order to maybe rebalance or right size that value exchange.
So the industry has always been a stratified economic model that consumers paid for some media and some media was free ad supported to them. And their data was always part of that. But in the old days, it was aggregated audience data. You know, Condé Nast would sell its audience profiles. It wasn't Shane or Bob or Joe. The difference now is with digital infrastructures like Google and Facebook, it's actually Shane and Bob and Joe. I think consumer awareness has grown. I'm not going to turn this into a PowerPoint presentation, but if anybody wants to get the complete slides I have, I'll send them the deck at joe@mediapost.com. But we did some research with advertiser perceptions and with Pollfish. We found actually consumer awareness is not perfect, but it's getting better. But when you ask consumers if they feel they should have control over this data, they absolutely do feel that way. And by the way, when you ask the ad industry, by and large, the ad industry believes that consumers should have control of the data. So the question I want to ask you is going back to the ethics core of this conversation, which is just because we can do something, should we be doing it? And, you know, fundamentally, should we be trading human beings as derivatives?
Well, you know, Maya Angelou once famously said the needs of a society determine its ethics. So I don't think ethics are fixed. I think obviously we're moving through here. If people agree to it, I think we'd all agree that if you had, I mean, let's go back to the behavioral economists. Let's go back to nudge, which is probably, you know, Thaler and Kahneman and the guys who've got a couple of Nobel Prizes, so they're pretty smart, all saying that people don't understand choice very well. If you put a, you know, the classic example is if you put a salad at the front of the buffet line, people eat more salad than if you put it at the end of the buffet line. Well, there's a, and then of course, then this raises the issue, is it morally, is it ethical to put the salad at the front of the buffet line? Is that a role that a buffet owner ought to take? So I'd say that I go back to consent and understanding. I think if consumers understand and think, as Shane said, and I think value exchange is exactly the right phrase, I think it was in Dave's quote, if there's a fair value exchange there, then I think it's perfectly acceptable. It's clear from the research we've done that most consumers, like 2/3 of consumers, would prefer to see ads than pay a subscription fee. And if you look at, you know, News Corp, you get 100 million monthly uniques for the New York Post and 2 million people pay for the Wall Street Journal. Pretty big audience subscription. The only way that's going to work is if the New York Post can sell ads, and the only way we know that a targeted ad is worth about 4 times as much as an untargeted ad. So it seems to me to say there's under no circumstances should we have derivatives in people, to use your phrase, Joe. I think you're dooming a lot of great press to non-existence. I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I guess just to offer my thoughts on that, I mean, I think I've always kind of, maybe similar to you, Joe, or actually very similar to you, Joe, I've always railed against the idea of buying audiences just for semantics sake. It just seems like a very strange kind of way to say it, and it does conjure up kind of the images that you said during the opening. I think, look, we are the MX agency. We're all about media experience, and we do so, as you said, through meaningful media. We talk about media. We plan and buy media. We craft media experiences. That's what we do as Havas Media, the agency. And so I think what we're doing is that we are getting infinitely better at understanding the media that is most meaningful to you. And our kind of hypothesis is little more proven than that, but our belief is that if we are associating our clients' brands and media that is meaningful to you, it will have a greater impact. But as I'm saying this, I'm saying the word media an awful lot. I'm not saying audiences. Are we able to pinpoint the audiences through those media to those media? Absolutely. As we understand a human being more, we're able to understand what media is truly meaningful to them. And so we're using that knowledge base. But I don't necessarily think that the industry is wholesale shifting to buying audiences versus buying media. We're still trying to enhance a client's brand by connecting them with the right audiences, the right consumers, but we're still using media and the media experience to do so.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the big issues, if I took in what both you and Bob said, is that it's complexity in education, and that, as Bob mentioned, there are a lot of interesting browsers out there that have not gotten much uptake with these models. I mean, you have something like Brave and the basic attention token. And I wonder, what will it take to give consumers real awareness of the fact that they're a participant in this new economy, and that if they give the proper data, they'll get the proper values back?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think to your awareness data and kind of what you were quoting before, I think plenty of consumers are aware. I don't necessarily think there's deep understanding or acknowledgement of the value exchange that both Bob and I mentioned earlier, that they don't truly understand the trade-offs and what would happen if they made certain decisions of this or certain decisions of that. To me, I think that's when I talk about an education campaign or an education effort. It's to get consumers to truly understand that value exchange and what does certain decisions they make or might make, what would be the actual result. I think a lot of consumers will say they believe a certain way or would do a certain thing, but if they truly understood what it would mean from their day in, day out browsing behavior, media behavior, data gathering behavior, et cetera, you kind of wonder if they would act the same way or make the same decision. So it's the depth of awareness or depth of understanding that I tend to talk about for me.
And I think Shane's absolutely right. People are more aware of it and say, as you said, Joe, I'm appalled. But I don't think there's much damage. I don't think most people, I mean 99% of people, have seen much damage in the status quo. A lot of irritation. Retargeting probably did more to frustrate people with the internet than any other single thing, in my humble opinion, based on no factual data, no disrespect to Criteo. But, take Cambridge Analytica, which was a huge scandal, unbelievably inappropriate. Facebook violated their own privacy policy, which never strikes me as a good business decision. But if you look at, people got messages they may have gotten otherwise, but there aren't 2,000 people running around saying I was harmed, except in sort of maybe a broad philosophical, this impacted the election and I don't like the outcome. But all this quote unquote lack of privacy has not accumulated into a perceptible harm for the vast majority of consumers. And until that starts, the ability to seize a cell phone and track your location in a divorce case probably did more to raise awareness of cell phone location data than all the public service spots in the world. But people have got to understand the cause for damage that the system brings, because they see pretty much the advantage. They get hey, I get the news for free. I get to talk to my friends on Facebook. I can type anything into this little search box and find it out instantaneously. And all ads are annoying, and ads well targeted by Havas are less annoying, but ads are still not that popular. We both used to work for Chiat Day, and occasionally we did great ads that everybody loved, but usually they were just ads that people weren't that wild about.
Well, You know, that's an interesting point you made about Cambridge Analytica. I do think actually Facebook experienced a lot of subscriber churn at that point, that people became aware. I'm one of the ones who opted out of Facebook since then. And they continue to grow because of their global footprint. But I think the more important issue is that it raised concern and awareness among consumers. It kind of peed in the pool. You had things like experience data leakage coming out at the same time. And I think what you're seeing is consumers they're full of angst and they're worried. They don't know what's going on. And I don't want to get into politics, but you know, when you add all these things together, this is not a good thing for the ad industry, who wants to rely on an open relationship with the consumer to opt in and experience things. To your point, Shane, about the experience agency, what can we do as an industry? It feels like the real issue here is you have some bad actors, you have a lot of clutter, you have a lot of confusion, but we all want to get at the same point, which is an ethical transmission of people's data, opting in and sharing with the brands they want to share with. How can we fix this problem?
Well, you know, one of the things we discovered at Brightpool is not only do you have a consumer problem, you have an industry problem. That third-party cookies are so inaccurate and cause so much duplication until you really get a verified supply chain where you know exactly who the person you're talking to is and exactly what publication they're appearing on. And, you know, Google has certainly, Apple, as I mentioned earlier, has already gotten rid of third-party cookies. Google is threatened to do so next year. But job one is we have to clean up our own supply chain, because if I put a chart up on the screen of how the current supply chain works, your head would hurt, because it's not simple. And that complication leads to a lot of confusion and duplication and unknowingness and the inability to transfer consent, lots of problems. And that's got to be fixed first, because consumers can agree or disagree all they want. And if there's not the technology in place to keep track of it, it's hopeless.
Yeah, and we did a lot of work in that regard, because obviously, to your opening, going back to your opening, Joe, about Havas, you know, we've pushed the envelope from transparency, and we took a look at that chain. We took a look at that kind of thing that Bob just threatened to show all of us, and we insisted upon transparency throughout, and we pushed really, really hard to do so. And we had a number of partners that kind of fell by the wayside because they weren't willing to offer transparency. Now, that was in large part geared more toward financial transparency, but that, you know, if it is amazing what can happen if you push in the right way and demand the right things, and you stand true in your convictions. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot, but I think some of the things that Bob said about the moving away from cookies and the cookieless future will go an awfully long way. I think CCPA and GDPR and other things like that have moved us in the right direction. I think we've got a lot further to go, and we need to keep pushing.
Yeah, but then we find new solutions that exploit people even more. So now we're using geolocation data tied to the device ID. When I talk to agencies and advertisers, they often use the concept of deterministic versus probabilistic. And how many points of data do they have enough about me to identify who I am? At MediaPost, we have a woman, Wendy Davis, who's an expert in covering regulation and law as it relates to this. And she says that within the advocacy industry, they don't believe you actually need anybody's identity data anymore to reasonably identify who they are. You can just basically do it mathematically now, because there's enough pieces of data about you out there that can reasonably assemble your behaviors and target you on that basis. So I don't know what the solution is. I'm asking you guys because you're both trying to solve this problem. The Institute of Advertising Ethics is putting a line in the sand now, having a day-long symposium about this. Is there anything you would suggest to the industry to take on, any steps that we could take towards self-regulation or risk mitigation to get out ahead of this? Do you want more GDPR or CCPA type initiatives? Obviously not. So what can we do? Is there any concrete steps you can recommend?
Well, I think, and we at Brightpool think that the advertiser, if we're going to have serious change, it has to be advertiser led. And the advertisers, and we've talked to the ANA about this a lot, and we've talked to other people in the industry about this. Our lawyer, Stu Ingus down in Venable, we obviously plugged into all Stu's efforts. But it seems to us that if advertisers demand something, it will happen. And if advertisers don't demand something, it'll be talked about. So I would hope, and even though the IAB is sort of trying to lead the charge with Project REARC, I hope that the ANA and the 4As use the power of the agency, use the power of the advertiser and the money to drive statistic change. Because if there's a sort of a code of ethics and here's how we're going to do this, and if you don't, as Shane said, and you can say if you don't follow this code, we're not going to advertise with you, you will get change pretty quickly.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up what we did with the digital, or more specifically the programmatic supply chain. We said we're not going to do business with you, and lo and behold, you had people go from a hard no to a well, maybe yes, and then ultimately yes. You know, it is funny how those things tend to work if you stand true and you are true in your convictions. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention what Bob and the folks at Brightpool are doing, what Killy is doing, what we are working with these companies that are creating, aggregating consumer data and consumer consent data, that if we had more options like that, not to give even more of a plug, but if we had more options like that, I think that would go a significantly long way too. I mean, let's face it, we have consumers that I mentioned earlier don't have the depth of awareness or the depth of understanding. I think, to be perfectly honest and candid, I think that's true of the advertising industry as well. And also, to be perfectly candid, there is the motivation factor as well. Is we need to motivate ourselves to make this kind of change and these kinds of changes as well.
Right. Well, listening to both of you, but especially Bob's point, do we need to codify this as industry standards so that, led by advertisers, that everybody can operate toward these principles? I know it's nice that the IAB and others are trying to re-architect the industry, but if this is going to be advertiser-led, I mean, this is an initiative we're talking about today with the AAF and the IAE, which the goal is to create a certification process. But should it be more self-regulatory in the sense of what the Media Rating Council would be in media, where there is a set of standards, it's codified, and you either get that stamp of approval or you don't?
I personally, I'll jump in here, Bob, please build on, but I would say you're on the right track with it. And it's probably some combination of the IAB and what they're doing in the data transparency labeling and whatnot, but also having it, having oversight from an industry body like an MRC, that accreditation, that seal of approval, as it were, does make a difference. And I think if we were to have something like that, I think it would actually go a long way, because again, as the knowledge base continues to grow and people understand it more, the momentum would gain, and you would have more and more folks supporting those companies and those offerings that have that seal of approval. Sorry, Bob, didn't mean to jump in there, but
no, it's great. It's great. I, you know, Shane and I both worked at Chiat Day, so we bring a certain Chiat Day attitude toward life. And I will now give you a Chiat Day attitude toward life, which is you got to have a T-shirt and an advertising campaign. But at the end of the day, both Shane and I have talked about the importance of consumer awareness. That awareness has to be built. If you look at all the big changes in society, they came around through a combination of trade groups doing stuff and consumers doing something and advertising campaigns. There's got to be a deal, but it's going to take more than a set of platitudes put on the wall, because they get pretty quickly run over. Consumers have to really understand what's going on, realize they have some choices, and realize it's worth, most importantly, in my opinion, realize it's worth their time to make those choices. Otherwise, people go, oh, it's not worth it. And of course, it's a transaction cost where the cost outweighs the benefit.
Yeah. And I think if I can just build on that, I think ultimately, to go back to Bob's point about, follow the money, if advertisers see that building a campaign, building an effort based on consumer consent targets, and it works, and there's great return, and there's great business building results, I'm very much a lead by example kind of guy. And so as we get some of those examples under our belt and we publicize the crap out of them, we highlight and showcase and celebrate, I think that too will go a long way, because everybody wants results. And I think as we show more and more that the results can come this way, I think that will help immensely as well.
Absolutely. And ironically, at Brightpool, some of the earliest traction we've gotten is with industries, Joe, that you mentioned earlier, that have already been regulated, pharma and financial services, who understand all the damage done to their clients' image of the general industry because of data leaks and breaches and all that kind of stuff. And they're saying, gee, if we could carve out a position as the most qualified, the most caring, the most thoughtful using your data, that would inure to our benefit. So I think let's not declare victory here, but I think there's some sprouts of green grass. I guess because it's spring, that's a fair metaphor to use today on that front.
It sounds like risk mitigation is still the #1 driver here, but I also want to come back to ethics. I mean, MediaPost had a story today based on reactions to George Floyd and Black Lives Matters over the last 2 weeks, because it's starting to, impact all of us as a society. And we're constantly trying to examine the industry's ethical issues and how it approaches everything it does, whether it's diversity, use of consumer data, trade practices, deceptive advertising, any of those things, because there's a theory that if you do the right thing, you'll win market share and customers. I mean, Havas has a whole case study of research done over a decade on meaningful brands and what does it take to be a meaningful brand. And just to sum it up, some of those attributes in there about being ethical and doing the right thing are really important to the consumer. Whether you say it in your ads or not, they know it. And so my question for you is, should it be more of a do the right thing approach than let's avoid getting caught kind of approach?
Well, I would disagree that the financial institutions we're talking to are trying to avoid getting caught. I think they see it as, if we can improve our image, we'll steal customers. Since everybody on the planet pretty much has a bank, their view is, how do I take business away from other banks, and with a good reputation I can do it. So I disagree that it's risk mitigation. I think it's market share enhancement, and I think that's a great motivator. It goes back to what I started this out. That's consumer self-sovereignty in the classic sense. That's consumers forcing the production of goods and services in society toward the way they want them. So I'm more optimistic than you are, Joe, about that.
Well, let's jump beyond the concept of data, because I know that's where all the focus is. But one of my personal interests is, are we really, data is a proxy for identifying a consumer, for knowing their behaviors, and for making offers and watching the ROI on the back end. But what we're really trying to do is drive consumer behaviors. And to your point, Bob, the banking industry might win more market share by being a better, more trusted bank. But they also spend a lot of money recruiting consumers. So Chase will pay $350 in cash for a new Chase customer. Other banks will pay upwards of $1,000 just to get the consumer to sample their services. brands give a lot of money directly to consumers, not just in the form of goods and services or advertising, but actually explicit economic exchange. So I'd like to ask both of you, how much of that should actually be part of the equation going forward? I mean, I believe Brightpool has it as part of its DNA, the concept of rewarding consumers directly. I know Havas has
Yeah,
talked about this. Go ahead.
no, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think you have to reward consumers. I think you can, if you want to think in terms of a continuum, you know, we used to think of give your best consumer the best price. Then we have loyalty programs, which is clearly trading money for continued patronage and paying people for their data and paying them or compensating them. Our research says you don't necessarily have to give them a lot of money, but rewarding them in some sense. I think that's part of the continuum that's in the future. And I think in 25 or 30 years, there will be some sort of systematic, well-adopted program. How we get from here to there is going to be complicated, but I think it's inevitable. And so I think the long arc of history is headed that direction, to make a bad paraphrase.
So Shane, is it just about the data or is it about rewarding consumers for behaviors? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think to build on what Bob said, I mean, it is, and again, I think this is in part based on the, again, lack of depth of knowledge or depth of awareness or understanding, but it is sometimes kind of remarkable when you think about what consumers are willing to do for surprisingly little value in the big scheme of things, you know, to give them first look, to give them a peek behind the curtain, to give them insider knowledge, even beyond just a coupon or dollars off or things like that. Like sometimes the value doesn't have to be a lot of actual financial value. It's just something that the consumer finds valuable. So there's intrinsic value. I think absolutely that should factor in and should play a role, because I think what we would find, and you're right, from a meaningful brand standpoint, we find a lot of what creates meaning for brands. And I think we actually find a lot of that information, that a brand can offer something that financially there isn't a tremendous amount of value, but if they are a meaningful brand and if a consumer has a relationship with them, sometimes something that we don't necessarily think as being a big deal or highly valuable, the consumer thinks is incredibly valuable and is willing to do a lot of things for it. And that can be a powerful piece of knowledge about the relationship between a brand and a consumer or its audience, beyond anything else.
Okay, well, I think we're getting close to our time now. We don't really have an audience Q&A component to this, but if anybody has questions they'd like me to try and get answered, just email me at joe@mediapost.com. I'd like to ask you both, do you have any kind of concluding thought to sum up what you'd like to leave the industry's impressions with as they start working, basically workshopping towards some kind of code of ethics here?
I have two hints. The first hint is think in a longer term, not a shorter term. Educating consumers is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a series of events to make that work. And we ought to be prepared to appreciate that. We certainly have learned that at Brightpool. Secondly, we're going to have to fix our internal plumbing before we can fix our external image, because our internal plumbing just doesn't work for this. It works for lots of other things, but not for any of this.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said. And I want to give kudos to Bob, the folks at Brightpool, and Killian, other organizations that are pushing for this. I think just to build on, so I don't repeat things that Bob said, although I agree emphatically, I think it's motivation to change. I think sometimes we as much of a change-oriented industry as we are, it really deep down, we don't like change very much. And I think there's all kinds of examples that we are tried and true that I don't have to repeat here. But for me, I think constantly having an appetite for change and a motivation for change, and dare I even refer to it as a need for change, I think is what we most need here, is people that understand the implications of not, understand the implications of doing so, and have an insatiable appetite for change. To me, that's a big part of what we're talking about here.
Well, I've been covering the death of the upfront for about 40 years now, so I know how those things can happen.
I figure I didn't need to say it because I knew you would.
But I'd like to check back a year from now and see what kind of progress the IAE and AAF make, and hopefully this will jumpstart part of that with this conversation. So I want to thank you both, Bob and Shane, for participating. And again, if anybody has any follow-ups or questions, just email me at joe@mediapost.com. Thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the day.
And thank you, Joe. Thank you for all your work. And Shane, great
Thank you,
discussion.
Bob. Thank you,
Thanks.
Joe. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.